The day my best friend's older brother came home was the day I realized some people return to your life for a reason you never expected. I had known Ethan Carter for years, but only from a distance. To me, he was always the older brother who seemed to have everything figured out. He was the person everyone in town talked about, the one who left after college to build a successful career, and the one who became a memory from another chapter of my life. I never imagined that his return would make me question everything I thought I knew. My name is Noah Bennett, and for most of my life I liked things predictable. I was 27 years old, working as an interior designer in a small American town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. I had a comfortable routine, a close group of friends, and a life that felt stable. My best friend, Caleb Carter, had been part of that life for years. We had shared countless memories, from late-night conversations during high school to weekend trips when we were older. Because of Caleb, his family always felt familiar to me. But Ethan was different. He was older, more confident, and always seemed like someone who belonged to a bigger world than the one I knew. The last time I saw him before he left town, I was still trying to figure out who I wanted to become. Ethan had already started chasing his dreams. He was studying architecture, traveling, and creating a future that seemed far away from my own. Years passed and I rarely thought about him. Then one ordinary Friday afternoon, Caleb called me with unexpected news. His brother was coming home. At first, I did not think much about it. I assumed it would simply be a family reunion, a chance for old memories to return, and then life would continue as normal. But when I arrived at the Carter family home that weekend, everything felt different. I saw Ethan standing outside, carrying boxes from his car, and for a moment, I barely recognized him. He was no longer the distant figure from my memories. He had changed. He seemed more mature, calmer, and somehow more approachable. When he noticed me, he smiled and greeted me like no time had passed. He remembered small details about my life that I had completely forgotten mentioning years ago. That surprised me. I expected polite conversation, but instead we talked easily. We laughed about old memories and shared stories about what had happened while he was away. I noticed something I had never noticed before. Behind the confident image everyone knew was someone who had his own doubts, challenges, and dreams. Ethan was not just Caleb's older brother. He was a person with a story I had never taken the time to understand. As the evening continued, I found myself paying attention to the way he spoke, the way he listened, and the way he looked at the town he once left behind. It felt strange because I was seeing him from a completely different perspective. I did not know why that moment felt important. I only knew that Ethan's return had already changed something. And the most surprising part was that I had a feeling this was only the beginning. After Ethan returned home, I thought everything would go back to normal. I assumed he would spend time with his family, reconnect with old friends, and eventually continue with whatever plans had brought him back to town. I did not expect him to become someone I would think about long after our conversations ended. But the more time I spent around Ethan, the more I realized that the person I remembered from years ago was only a small part of who he really was. A few days after the family gathering, Caleb invited me over for dinner. Since Ethan was staying with his family for a while, seeing him again was becoming more common. At first, I tried not to make too much of it. Ethan was still my best friend's older brother, someone I had known for years. But every conversation revealed something new about him. During dinner, we talked about his life away from town. Ethan explained that working as an architect in a busy city had been exciting, but it was not always the life he imagined. He had spent years chasing achievements, building projects, and proving himself, but somewhere along the way, he realized he missed the simplicity of home. He missed knowing the people around him, having meaningful conversations, and feeling connected to a community. Hearing him say that surprised me because everyone had always viewed Ethan as someone who had everything figured out. I realized that success did not mean a person never felt uncertain. Sometimes the people who appeared the most confident were carrying questions that no one else could see. Later that evening, while everyone else was busy talking, Ethan and I ended up sitting outside together. The quiet moment felt surprisingly comfortable. We talked about how much the town had changed and how different our lives looked compared to when we were younger. Ethan asked me about my work and what I wanted for the future. I was surprised by how genuinely interested he seemed. Most people asked questions just to be polite, but Ethan actually listened to my answers. I told him that I enjoyed designing spaces because I liked creating places where people felt comfortable and connected. He smiled and said that was something he understood because architecture was also about creating environments where people could feel something. That small conversation stayed with me because it showed me we shared more in common than I expected. Before that night, I had always thought of Ethan as someone who lived in a completely different world. He was older, more experienced, and someone I had placed on a higher level in my mind. But sitting there, talking about dreams and life choices, I realized he was not as distant as I had imagined. He was simply another person trying to find his way. Over the next few weeks, our paths crossed more often. Sometimes it was during family dinners, sometimes when Caleb invited us both to spend time together, and sometimes through unexpected moments around town. Each interaction made Ethan feel less like a memory from my past and more like someone present in my life. I started noticing small things about him that I had never paid attention to before. The way he remembered details from conversations, the way he treated people with respect, and the way he always made others feel included. I found myself looking forward to these moments, even though I did not fully understand why. Ethan had returned home expecting to reconnect with his past. I had no idea that his return would make me see my own life differently. The person I once only knew as my best friend's older brother was slowly becoming someone I wanted to know more about. The more I talked with Ethan, the more I realized that my first impression of him had been completely incomplete. For years, I had only seen him through the perspective of being my best friend's older brother. He was someone I respected, someone I admired from a distance, but never someone I truly knew. Now that he was back home, I was discovering the person behind the image everyone remembered. One afternoon, Caleb asked me to help Ethan with a small project around his family's house. Since Ethan had returned, he had been working on ideas for a new architectural project that connected modern designs with the traditional style of the town. I agreed because it seemed like a simple favor, but I did not expect it to become one of the most memorable days I had spent with him. We spent hours walking through different parts of the property, discussing ideas and sharing our thoughts. What surprised me was how easy it was to talk with him. There was no awkward silence or feeling that I needed to impress him. Ethan treated me like an equal, not just his younger brother's friend. He asked for my opinions and genuinely considered my ideas. That small detail meant more than I expected because I was used to seeing Ethan as someone who had already accomplished everything. I never imagined he would value my perspective. During our conversation, Ethan asked me why I chose interior design. I told him that I liked creating spaces that reflected the people who lived in them. I enjoyed the idea that a room could hold memories, emotions, and stories. Ethan smiled and said that was exactly why he loved architecture. He believed buildings were not just structures. They were places where people's lives happened. Hearing him say that made me realize how similar our ways of thinking were. We both worked in creative fields, but more importantly, we both cared about creating meaningful experiences for others. As the afternoon continued, Ethan shared more about his years away from home. He told me that leaving town had been exciting, but it also came with moments of loneliness. He had achieved many goals, but he sometimes wondered whether he had been too focused on success and not focused enough on the people around him. I was surprised by how honest he was. The Ethan everyone talked about seemed confident and certain, but the person sitting beside me was someone who had questions and doubts just like everyone else. That conversation changed the way I saw him. I realized that I had spent years looking up to Ethan without ever considering that he might also need someone who understood him. For the first time, I felt like I was not just listening to stories about his life. I was sharing a real connection with him. After that day, our conversations became more frequent. We talked about books, movies, childhood memories, and the small things that shaped who we became. Sometimes we would sit with Caleb and talk as a group, but other times Ethan and I would continue conversations long after everyone else had left. I noticed that I looked forward to those moments more than I wanted to admit. There was something comforting about talking with someone who understood the importance of dreams, change, and finding a place where you truly belonged. Ethan had returned home thinking he needed to reconnect with the town he left behind. But unknowingly, he was also creating a new connection with me. And I was beginning to realize that the person I once saw only as my best friend's older brother was becoming someone much more significant in my life. As the weeks went by, I started noticing that my relationship with Ethan was changing in ways I never expected. It was not something that happened suddenly. There was no single moment that changed everything. Instead, it developed through small conversations, shared experiences, and the growing feeling that Ethan was someone I could truly understand. I had spent years seeing him as someone distant, someone who belonged to a different stage of life. But now, I was beginning to see him as a person with hopes, fears, and stories that were much closer to my own. One Saturday morning, Ethan invited me to join him at a local community event, where he was presenting some ideas for his new architectural project. Since I worked in interior design, he thought I might enjoy seeing how different creative minds approached the same space. I agreed, and as we walked through the event together, I realized how naturally we worked as a team. We discussed colors, designs, and the emotions that certain places could create. It felt less like a conversation between my best friend's older brother and his younger friend, and more like a conversation between two people who shared the same passion. During the event, I watched Ethan interact with different people. He was patient, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in what others had to say. I had always assumed confidence meant having all the answers, but Ethan showed me that true confidence could also come from listening and being open to new ideas. That was one of the qualities I admired most about him. Later that afternoon, we stopped at a small cafe near the town square. It became one of those quiet moments where a simple conversation turned into something more meaningful. Ethan asked me if I had ever considered leaving town and exploring a different life somewhere else. I admitted that I had thought about it many times, but I always found reasons to stay. I told him that I liked the comfort of familiarity, even though sometimes I wondered what I might be missing. Ethan understood because he had experienced the opposite. He had left home searching for new opportunities, but after years away, he realized that success was not only about reaching new places. It was also about appreciating the people and moments that made life meaningful. That conversation made me think about my own choices. I had always admired Ethan for being brave enough to leave, but I never considered that returning home could require just as much courage. Coming back meant facing old memories, reconnecting with people, and accepting that life had changed while he was away. As we continued talking, I noticed how comfortable I felt sharing parts of myself that I usually kept private. I told him about my worries about the future and the pressure I sometimes felt to have everything figured out. Ethan did not try to give me simple answers. Instead, he listened and shared his own experiences. That was what made our conversations different. He did not make me feel like I needed to become someone else. He made me feel understood. After that day, I began looking forward to seeing Ethan more than I expected. I would find myself smiling when Caleb mentioned that his brother would be joining us for dinner, or when Ethan sent a message asking about my latest design project. I knew something was changing, but I did not know exactly what it meant. All I knew was that Ethan's return had brought someone into my life who challenged the way I viewed connection. The person I once thought was simply part of my past was slowly becoming someone I wanted to know in the present. The more time I spent with Ethan, the harder it became to ignore how much his return had changed my everyday life. I had expected him to come back, spend time with his family, and eventually move on to whatever came next. I never expected him to become someone I would look forward to seeing, someone whose opinions mattered to me, and someone who made me question the way I had always approached relationships. The strange thing was that nothing about it felt forced. It happened naturally through conversations, shared interests, and moments that seemed ordinary at the time but stayed in my mind afterward. One evening, Caleb invited me over for dinner, and as usual, Ethan was there. We spent the night talking about different topics, laughing about old memories, and sharing stories from our lives. At one point, Caleb stepped away to answer a phone call, leaving Ethan and me alone at the table. Normally, I might have felt uncomfortable with the silence, but with Ethan, it felt easy. We started talking about the years he spent away from home and the experiences that shaped him. Ethan admitted that returning to town was not as simple as he expected. He had spent so much time building a life somewhere else that he was not sure where he truly belonged anymore. I understood that feeling more than I thought I would. I told him that sometimes I felt the same way, even though I had never left. I explained that I had built a comfortable life, but there were moments when I wondered if I was staying because I was happy or because I was afraid of change. Ethan looked at me and said something that stayed with me. He said that sometimes people confuse being comfortable with being fulfilled. Hearing that made me reflect on my own choices. For years, I had focused on creating a stable future, but I rarely asked myself what kind of future would actually make me feel alive. Ethan had a way of asking questions that made me think deeper without making me feel judged. That was something I appreciated about him. He never acted like he had all the answers. He simply shared his experiences and allowed me to discover my own. Over the next few days, I noticed myself becoming more aware of how much I enjoyed our conversations. I found myself remembering small details Ethan mentioned, like his favorite places to visit or the projects he hoped to create. I noticed how he always remembered things I told him too. He would ask about a design idea I had mentioned weeks earlier or check how a project at work was going. Those small gestures meant more than I expected because they showed that he was paying attention. But with that realization came a feeling I did not fully understand. I started becoming aware that Ethan was no longer just someone I admired. He was someone I felt connected to. That thought made me pause because of who he was and how our lives were connected. He was still Caleb's older brother, someone who had always been part of my world in a familiar but distant way. I wondered if I was simply confused because he had returned and everything felt different. Maybe I was just seeing him in a new way because of the circumstances. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than admiration and friendship. But every time we talked, every time he smiled, and every time he showed genuine interest in my life, I found myself wanting to know him even more. Ethan had come home expecting to rediscover his old life. Somehow, his return had started changing mine too. And for the first time, I began wondering if this connection meant something more than I was willing to admit. Sometimes the person who changes your life is the one you thought you already knew. I never expected those words to become the truth of my own story, but standing there in the quiet of that familiar neighborhood, I finally understood how much had changed since the day he came back home. For years, I had known him only as my best friend's older brother, the person everyone described with a mixture of respect and curiosity. He was the responsible one, the person who left town to build his own future, and the person who seemed impossible to reach. But after his return, I discovered there was much more behind the calm expression everyone admired. His name was Ethan Parker, and he was no longer just a distant figure from my childhood memories. He was someone carrying his own regrets, hopes, and unfinished chapters. My best friend Lily noticed the change before I did. She saw the way conversations that once felt ordinary suddenly became meaningful. She saw how Ethan listened carefully whenever I spoke, not because he was being polite, but because he genuinely cared about the small details of my life. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was simply because he had known me for so long. Maybe he was just being kind because I was his sister's closest friend. But kindness alone did not explain the way he looked at the world around him, as if he was finally learning to appreciate moments he had once ignored. One evening, after helping Lily prepare for a family gathering, I stayed behind to clean up the kitchen. The house was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of rain outside and the warm glow of the lights above us. Ethan walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, remembering exactly how I liked mine. It was such a small gesture, but somehow it felt bigger than anything dramatic or unforgettable. "You always notice things about people," he said quietly, "even when nobody noticed you." I smiled because those words reached a part of me I rarely showed anyone. Growing up, I had always been the person standing nearby, supporting others, listening to their problems, and celebrating their victories. I never expected someone like Ethan to see me differently. That night, we talked about the years we had spent apart. He told me about leaving home, chasing success, and realizing that achievements did not mean much without people to share them with. I told him about my own dreams and the fears I carried quietly. For the first time, I did not feel like I was speaking to my best friend's older brother. I felt like I was speaking to someone who truly understood me. The most surprising part was not that Ethan had changed. It was realizing that I had changed too. The person who returned home was not the only one discovering something new. I was discovering that sometimes the connections we overlook are the ones that have been waiting patiently for us all along. The days after that conversation felt different, not because something dramatic had changed overnight, but because the small moments between us started carrying a meaning I could no longer ignore. Ethan Parker was still the same person everyone knew, calm, thoughtful, and dependable. But now I saw the parts of him that had always been hidden beneath that confident exterior. He was not just the older brother who had returned home after years away. He was someone searching for a place where he truly belonged. Lily noticed our growing connection, and surprisingly, she was not upset or uncomfortable. Instead, she smiled whenever she caught us talking, as if she had already understood something that took me much longer to accept. She reminded me that Ethan had always been different around people he trusted. He was not the distant person many believed him to be. He simply needed someone who looked beyond the image everyone created for him. One Saturday morning, Ethan invited me to visit a small community garden he had started helping with since coming back home. It was a place away from the noise of the town, filled with flowers, wooden benches, and neighbors sharing stories over coffee. Watching him interact with everyone showed me another side of him. He was patient with children learning how to plant seeds, respectful toward older residents sharing advice, and genuinely happy in a way I had never seen before. He told me that after years of chasing success, he realized the moments that mattered most were the simple ones. A conversation on a quiet afternoon, a familiar laugh from someone you cared about, a place where you did not have to pretend to be perfect. I understood then that Ethan's return was not just about coming back to a familiar house. It was about finding himself again. Later that day, we sat on a wooden bench beneath a large tree while the sun slowly moved across the sky. Ethan admitted that leaving home had been easier than facing the feelings he left behind. He had spent years believing that moving forward meant forgetting the past, but he eventually learned that some memories were not chains holding you back. Some memories were reminders of who you truly were. I shared my own fears with him, including the worry that I was always meant to stay in the background of other people's stories. Ethan looked at me and said something I would never forget. He told me that everyone deserved to be seen, not just appreciated for what they could give to others. Those words stayed with me because they described exactly what had happened between us. We had both spent years believing we needed to become someone else before we could find happiness. But maybe happiness was not about becoming different. Maybe it was about finally allowing someone to see the person who had been there all along. As the evening arrived and we walked back toward the house, I realized the biggest change was not that Ethan had returned. The biggest change was that two people who had known each other for years were finally meeting for the first time. The day I realized Ethan Parker had changed my life was not marked by a grand moment or a dramatic announcement. It was a quiet afternoon, sitting in the same town where our story had started, thinking about how different everything felt compared to a few months earlier. When Ethan first returned home, I believed he was simply someone from my past coming back for a short time. I never imagined that his return would help me understand myself better and show me the importance of a connection built on honesty, patience, and trust. Over time, Ethan and I continued spending time together in simple ways. We visited local places, shared conversations over coffee, and supported each other's dreams. Nothing felt rushed. We were not trying to force anything to happen. Instead, we allowed every moment to reveal who we truly were. I learned that Ethan was not the perfect person everyone thought he was. He had doubts, fears, and moments when he questioned his own choices. But those imperfections were what made him real. Ethan also helped me see something about myself that I had ignored for years. I had always been the person who supported others, but I rarely allowed anyone to support me. I thought being independent meant carrying everything alone. Ethan showed me that letting someone understand you was not a weakness. It was a way of building something meaningful. One evening, we returned to the same place where we had first talked after his arrival home. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets were familiar, and the feeling reminded me of how much had changed. Ethan looked around and said that when he came back, he expected to find the person he used to be. Instead, he found a new version of himself. I understood exactly what he meant because I felt the same way. His return had not only changed how I saw him, it had changed how I saw my own life. I finally understood that some people enter our lives at the exact moment we need to learn something important. Ethan taught me that home was not just a place. It was the people who made you feel understood. It was the conversations that allowed you to be honest. It was the moments when you no longer felt like you had to hide parts of yourself. Looking back, I realized that I had spent years believing our story began when Ethan came home. But maybe it actually began much earlier, through every shared memory, every small conversation, and every moment that quietly connected our paths. The person I once knew only as my best friend's older brother became someone who showed me a different way to see life, relationships, and myself. Ethan returned home expecting to reconnect with the past, but what he found was a future he never expected. And what I found was a reminder that the most meaningful connections often arrive in the most unexpected ways.